I'm here with Dr. Guillermo Belt, who will talk a little bit about the Organization of American States, or OAS, and about his experience working in that institution.
Thank you very much. I think we should start by saying that the Organization of American States is the oldest organization of its kind in the world. And that sounds like very, very old, and it is indeed. When you go back to the original idea on which the OAS was inspired, you have to go back to the late 19th century. You have to go back specifically to the thinking of Simón Bolívar, the great Latin American liberator. As a matter of fact, some of the terms currently in use at the OAS, especially the designation of its main political organs, can be traced back, word for word, to some of the ideas of Bolívar. To give you an example, the expression reunión de consulta in Spanish, meeting of consultation in English, was one that was used back then by Bolívar in trying to establish a mechanism of coordination for the then emerging new republics of Latin America. So the origins, the historical origins, are very old indeed. In its current form, the OAS was born as such with the name Organization of American States in 1948. That took place at a meeting, a high-level meeting, a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs that took place in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, that year of 1948. Since then, there have been a number of changes, but not to the basic mission. The basic mission of the OAS, the basic objective of the OAS back in 1948 was to preserve, strengthen, and promote democracy in all the member states of the organization. Originally, before the name Organization of American States was adopted at the charter of the OAS as the constitution of the OAS, what for a country would be a constitution, in international organizations is called a charter. The charter of the OAS of 1948 establishes those objectives. And those objectives, through the years since then, have sometimes been achieved with success that one can clearly trace to the activity of the OAS, and in some cases not. In some cases, success has not been achieved despite the efforts of the OAS. So I would say it has a mixed record of successes and failures in the effort to promote, preserve democracy for all of the member states. In its very early origins, before the name OAS, there were 21 member states. That would be the 20 countries of what we know as Latin America, or Hispanic America, if you like. But if we use Latin America, then we include both Brazil and Haiti, which are not properly Hispanic America. So if we say Latin America, those are the 20 countries, together with the United States, that formed the then called Pan American Union, the entity precursor directly to the OAS. Nowadays, the OAS has a good many more members. It went up to a top of 35 member states. Currently, it's a little bit lower than that because very, very unfortunately, for the first time in its history, for the first time since 1948 at least, and further back if you go to the Pan American Union, countries have decided to abandon the OAS. In international parlance, when you want to withdraw from a treaty, and the OAS is based on a treaty, the charter is a treaty, one does what is called the denunciation of the charter. The denunciation of the treaty is simply a word that indicates that a member state notifies the other member states that it intends to withdraw from the treaty, convention, whatever international agreement it entered willingly and decides to leave. This has happened to the OAS in recent times, very, very unfortunately. Countries that withdrew voluntarily from the OAS are first Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro, and more recently Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega. In both cases, authoritarian regimes, regimes that no longer have any semblance of democratic governance. And both these countries, first Venezuela, as I said, and then more recently Nicaragua a couple of years ago, denounced the OAS Charter. After 2 years went by, which is what the Charter states, that withdrawal became effective. Therefore, as of today, those two original member states are no longer member states. There's a very curious thing that I should mention to you. Way before this unfortunate situation occurred, Cuba, the regime, current regime in Cuba, was suspended from OAS participation. Never expelled from the OAS. There is no provision in any of its documents for expulsion, but there is for suspension. And the regime in Cuba was suspended many, many years ago. Cuba, however, has never denounced the OAS Charter. Cuba has never denounced any of the other treaties upon which the OAS is based. So the regime in Cuba does not participate, has been invited to return to the OAS and participate again, and has refused to do so. I mention this because I believe strongly that it was Cuba's example, the example given by the dictatorial regime in Cuba, that was followed several years later, many years later, I would say, by Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela first, and then by Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. In both cases, because these two authoritarian rulers were afraid that a suspension might come their way. And before, rather than risking the possibility of being suspended, as Cuba was in the early 1960s, these two dictators decided to withdraw formally, to denounce the charter, to wait the 2 years that the charter sets forth, and now are no longer members. That is an unfortunate occurrence, as I've said a couple of times before, and one that has to be taken into consideration. I would simply add in closing, in regard to my personal experience, that I was very fortunate to work at the OAS for 42 years. That's a very long time. I started to work there as a Cuban exile, having left my country and come to the United States. And after a certain amount spent in Miami originally, more than a year, I had to come to Washington and went to work at the OAS. I was very fortunate that in the early 1990s, I was able to participate by the kind invitation of the Secretary General at that time, a Brazilian diplomat, recently deceased, Ambassador João Clemente Baena Suarez. I was able to participate with him in 4 of the 5 missions that the OAS undertook in the latter part of his 10-year mandate. He was elected for 5 years, as all Secretaries General are, and then re-elected for another 5 years, so he had a full 10-year term between 1984 and 1994. And in the latter part of those years, there was a tremendous activity of the OAS in support of democratic institutions. And in 4 of the most complicated missions that we undertook at the time to achieve that noble purpose that the organization has had since its founding, I was privileged to accompany the Secretary General in those missions. So I've seen the OAS at work. I've seen the OAS in theory, and I've seen it in practice. And I consider myself simply lucky, fortunate, to have been able to participate in some of the successful missions that were undertaken. Not all of them were. We were not able to succeed in Panama, for example, when we tried to persuade General Noriega to abandon power. We had persuaded all the political parties to come again to join together in another election. The results of the first election had been arbitrarily annulled by Noriega. We had been able to persuade Noriega's representatives in the 5 dialogues that we supervised in Panama at the time to accept new elections. And at the very last moment, General Noriega decided that he would not go along with the agreements that had been reached with the political parties. This ended in a personal tragedy for him. He was captured by United States troops that at one point invaded Panama. I have to say the word because that's what happened, and was brought back to the United States, was put on trial, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, which he fulfilled to the very last day. In that case, obviously, we were unable to persuade the strongman to accept a political solution that everybody else thought would be workable and which we in the OAS proposed. In other cases, for example, in Guatemala, when there was a self-coup by the legitimately elected president there, Serrano Elias, we were able to persuade Serrano to leave his presidential position, his position as president of the country, because of the arbitrary measures that he had undertaken in the face of a complete rejection by most of the country's leaders and by the country's institutions. We were successful there because we persuaded him to leave power in the face of that opposition. So I give these 2 examples simply to show you that diplomacy, however noble its objectives may be, however competent its practitioners may be, does not always end as we would hope and we would like in success. Sometimes you have to be prepared not to succeed, but to keep on trying. That's basically what I would take away from my long and always remembered fondly service at the Organization of American States. And I thank Professor Pedreira for this opportunity to speak to you, his students, in regard to this organization. So noble in purpose, successful when it can, and not so much when it hasn't been able to carry out the purposes for which it was founded many, many years ago. Thank you.